I think that's our cue to get ready for what has been what will be the final day, the third day of what has been a great event. I want to thank everybody, our sponsors and everybody, our exhibitors are out there. We've just had a tremendous, week of thought leadership, exchange of ideas, bringing different perspectives and a greater understanding for the challenges facing our naval forces as we go forward. And just as a reminder, we're going to have a great panel here, discussion over the luncheon period. Today, or this morning rather, it's my pleasure to introduce someone who's certainly no stranger. He kicked things off for us on Tuesday morning and really got us thinking kind of at a strategic level. And so I'm again honored to have the privilege of introducing Admiral Jim Stavridis, United States Navy retired, who is also the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. There are very few people in the world who have a broader perspective of what's going on from an international security perspective than he does. Former Supreme Allied Commander, Europe and Southern Command Commander. He just brings a tremendous perspective. And today he's going to introduce our guest speaker for this morning and lead him with a discussion that I think will be certainly entertaining and thought-provoking and educational for all of us here, and that has to deal with this world of cyber that we're in. So without any further discussion, I'd like to welcome Admiral Stavridis to the stage.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I think, first of all, it's an extraordinary pleasure to be here, but particularly because my very enjoyable task this morning is to introduce the real star of the morning show, and that's my good friend, Admiral Mike Rogers. Can I welcome you to the
Jim,
stage,
please.
sir?
Thank you.
Great. So this is a very relaxed format we're going to use.
Pretend no one's here.
Yeah,
it's just you and me.
Exactly. Think of me as Charlie Rose. What we're going to do, first of all, I want to tell you a little bit about Mike Rogers, just for 2 or 3 minutes. I think most folks know him and his background well. And then we're just kind of going to go back and forth, if it's okay with you, Mike, on cyber and how it plays, and then we'll open it up to some questions and comments as we go along. Let me begin by just telling you the most important thing you need to know about 4-star Admiral, brilliant cryptologist, cyber expert Mike Rogers. He owes it all to the fact that he started his career as a surface warfare officer.
Hoorah.
And I know we have many SWOs in the audience who fully understand that. Mike came out of Auburn University, go War Eagles, and then went to USS Karen on the Norfolk waterfront. Pete Daly, I think, knows that ship. Admiral Crowder knows that ship. Very famous Spruance-class destroyer, and actually was well known in the Spruance community for having the most advanced cryptological capability at that time. I think I'm correct.
Can-do Karen.
Yeah, exactly. And Mike then made the leap over to cryptology and had just an unstoppable career. And what's unique about his career is that he really flowed back and forth quite seamlessly between pure cryptology type assignments, code breaker, listener kind of stuff, into super high level intel jobs. So Mike was the J2 on the Joint Staff. He was the J2 at Pacific Command, which I think still has the largest JIC of all of them, largest Joint Intelligence Center. And eventually, as the Navy correctly created the 10th Fleet, became a 10th Fleet commander, and then moved very seamlessly into his current assignment as the director of the National Security Agency. So an extraordinary career, and we're lucky to have him here with us.
Thanks. I've been very lucky, been very fortunate.
So Mike, let's kind of begin by saying the Uber question has got to be, for everybody in this audience, we've spent our lives thinking about how to conduct combat operations in the physical domain. Now we are going to do a lot, maybe all at times, of our operations in this virtual domain that you understand so deeply. What does that shift mean, and how's it going?
So to me, I urge people, look, don't be intimidated by the technical aspects. Don't be intimidated by this is different in some ways than the traditional fields that most of us have experienced. Because I argue cyber is an operational domain in which we do a variety of missions and functions, many of which are very traditional. We do reconnaissance, we do fires, we do maneuver, we have key terrain. The same things I was used to as a surface officer, as a TAO when I first started out on Karen, I constantly am always going back to that. Hey, how can we frame this in a way that brings a broader sense of recognition and makes it easier to integrate this into a broader set of operational activities? Don't make this thing so specialized, so unique, so different, then it just gets pushed to the side. That will sub-optimize our ability to execute cyber operations, and quite frankly, it will minimize, or at least negatively impact, in my view, the operational outcomes, which is the whole reason we're doing this in the first place. If it doesn't generate operational outcome, whether it be the offensive or defensive application of cyber, it is a waste of our time and it's a waste of an investment. We've got to focus on generating operational outcomes.
Totally agree. Let me ask the question in a slightly different way. So if you had that proverbial blank sheet of paper to sketch out the way in which we ought to be structured and organized, if you will, trained, equipped, and organized in this space, what would that look like? In other words, and just to put a time frame on it, Mike, let's think about from where we are now over, say, a 5 to 10 year horizon.
Right. So here's what I think we're going to look like in 5 to 10 years, and the arguments that I would make.
Yeah.
Hey, here's what we need to build towards. In the immediate near term, elevate cyber commando and combatant commander. I think that's pretty easy. There's really no pushback. Not that there aren't aspects of it that some will potentially have a different view, but I think the potential for that happening in the near term is high, even as I acknowledge, hey, it's not my decision and there are other perspectives. What I want to see in the 5 to 10 year time frame is, can we integrate cyber both offensively and defensively down to the operational tactical level? At the moment, we tend to differentiate between the offensive and the defense, in no small part policy, ROE, which is not a criticism of everybody, it's just where we are right now in the journey of cyber.
Right.
Offensive cyber in some ways is treated almost like nuclear weapons, in the sense that their application outside a defined area of hostilities is controlled at the chief executive level and is not delegated down. What I hope to see over the next 5 to 10 years is, can we demonstrate enough confidence or engender enough confidence in our decision makers and our policy makers? Hey, you should feel comfortable pushing this down to the tactical level. We should be integrating this into the strike group and the amphibious expeditionary side, that we should view this as another toolkit that's available to a commander as a commander is coming up with a broad scheme of maneuver to achieve a desired outcome or end state. That's what I hope. That would be my argument.
This sounds a lot like the journey of special forces in a certain sense. So if you go back 25 years ago, special forces were sort of off to the side. They were called in for special occasions. Their use was highly controlled. Today, each combatant commander has not only a land, air, sea component command, a Marine Corps component command, but today has a special operations component command. When I was Southern Command, I had a superb one in Miami and at UCOM in Stuttgart. Mike, have we thought about the idea of a cyber component command assigned to each of the combatants?
Again, I think go to that 5 to 10 years. I totally agree. My argument is the soft model, I think, is very illuminative in cyber.
Yeah.
So I would create Cyber Command much in the image of SOCOM. Give it that broad set of responsibilities where it not only is taking forces fielded by the services and employing them, it's articulating the requirement and the vision, and you're giving it the resources to both create the capacity and then employ it. I would argue that's a good model. Likewise, another thing as you highlight that I like about the soft model is SOCOM provides a theater special operations commander across all 9, the other 8, combatant commanders.
Correct.
That's a model I think we should drive to. The reason why I have argued up to date that's probably not an optimal investment of finite capacity is, look, until we can get approval to delegate much of this down to that level, it doesn't make any sense to me. Why would you create a C2 construct, tie up scarce manpower if it's not going to be able to actually conduct the full range of operations?
Yeah.
That's what I'm hoping in 5 to 10 years we can get to.
No, I think that's very illuminative. I'll just make an observation from NATO, which is in NATO we have, for each of the sort of equivalents of combatant commands in NATO, they have components, air, sea, land. They don't as yet have a special operations component. So the halfway house at NATO is to create a centralized organization that can feed
Right.
special operators. I think
And that's where we are right now. The
Exactly.
reality is, my argument has been, how do we treat any high demand, low density resource in the department? We traditionally tend to centralize it, then prioritize its application by risk and operational priority. And I would argue that we need to do the exact same thing in cyber. That's another thing I would argue I would hope it would change in 5 to 10 years. When we created this construct in May, Cyber Command will celebrate its 7th anniversary as an organization. When we created this construct, we aligned all of its maneuver elements, those cyber teams. There's 133 teams, 6,187 individuals. We aligned all those teams against specific COCOMs, services, or functions, DISA, for example, has. My argument is I understand why we did it that way. It was to achieve a broad consensus, get everybody to agree. As we have created capacity and we're doing more and more work, my argument has been the reality of not having enough means we have got to treat this just like we do ISR. We manage this centrally, and we prioritize it, and we apply it based on a risk and a prioritization model, not, hey, we've locked everything down. These belong to this organization, these belong to that organization. Oh, well, you're on your own. I think we need to apply that same lesson here, and that's something for us at Cyber Command we'll be working on in the next year. I've teed up some ideas to the leadership about it. I think there's some things we could do differently in that regard.
makes enormous sense. And I know this conference heard from one of your subordinate commands, Mike Gilday,
Mike, yeah.
who I think is doing marvelous work at 10th Fleet, doing the Navy piece of what you're describing.
Much better job than this predecessor. He's done a much better job than I ever did.
So let's talk about where do we find these people? You're talking about 6,000 or so who are on the cyber reaction teams and so on, as well as a myriad of defenders, offensive, R&D kind of people. How tough is the fight for talent, Mike, as you sit in your
Right.
unique seat?
So knock on wood. The force right now is about 80% military, 20%. If you look at the billet structure, it's about 80% military, 20% civilian. The civilian side, interestingly, a little less on the Cyber Command side, but just putting on my other hat for a minute on the NSA side, which is 60% civilian, 40% military. It's a little bit harder on the civilian side. On the military side, what we're finding is the same thing that motivates a young man or woman to want to be a rifleman as a Marine, to want to work the flight line as an Air Force individual, or to be a deck seaman is, hey, look, I want to be part of something bigger than myself. I like the ethos and the culture of the military and the service. That's another real selling point for us right now. The self-image of this workforce is that they are the digital warriors of the 21st century. The way they look at themselves, hey, we're in the future, we're the cutting edge, we're doing something new, we are blazing a path. You can't, as a leader, you cannot underestimate the value of that. It is incredible. The other thing that, quite frankly, also I remind them is, look, you're gonna have the ability to do some things in uniform within a defense and law of armed conflict application you can't do anywhere else. Yeah. There's unique skills that you can do here, and we're gonna give you responsibility like the rest of the military. Our model is we're gonna spend time up front training you, and then as you show your proficiency and your ability to execute, we're gonna give you responsibility at a junior level. Everybody responds well to that. So knock on wood, we're able to assess, and retention is good right now. I'm the first to acknowledge it could change, but I have yet to run into a situation between my last job and this job, so, coming up on 6 years, I guess, where we did not have the skill set to work an issue. Now, sometimes the challenge is we have a handful of people with this skill set, so our challenge is building capacity.
Yeah, exactly. Let's kind of broaden the conversation a little bit to cybersecurity for the nation. The new administration has been highly energetic in releasing a whole series of executive orders, some of which have sparked a fair amount of controversy. Others have been reasonably well received. Mike, I keep hearing that there's a draft executive order on cybersecurity. I hear pretty good things about it from my sources. What can you share with us? When do you think we'll see that? I know you're right in the middle of that.
Right, so there's an ongoing dialogue. The administration, I don't want to speak for them, but if you just take their statements, they have been very upfront about the desire to make this a priority and a focus area in the early stages of the administration. I've participated in discussion with the president about this, where he broadly talked to a group of us who were, he had identified as, hey, these are some key cyber leaders, intellectual thought. Hey, I want you to know, I want to get a sense for what you're thinking. I want you to know this is important to me. I want you to know I believe in accountability and I want to move forward on this. So I expect that to play out sometime in the immediate near term. Process always sometimes takes longer than you would like, but I think this would play out. The biggest input that I've tried to provide, and I'm just one voice, is take advantage of the opportunity to step back and look at this with a new set of eyes and say, look, if we were creating this from the ground up, how would we do it? As opposed to, I have a starting point and we're just gonna build off that. I'm not arguing that's bad necessarily, but my view is don't get trapped by the bureaucracy. Step back, take a clean look at this, and let's take advantage of the lessons we've learned rather than just defaulting to, well, let's just keep doing it the way we always have.
I agree with that, and as you know, I spent some time with the president and his senior team, and this came up in that conversation. And I was encouraged by the level of concern, the understanding of how big a danger this is to the nation, and frankly, I'm happy that they haven't rushed this one out. This is a classic case of you want it bad, you get it bad. That's certainly been the case in a couple of other circumstances. So let's hope that it rolls, but does so in a measured way, taking advantage of voices like you.
And I do like, one other riff real quick.
Yeah.
I do like the idea of, look, we need to think about cyber more broadly, and we need to think about it from a national security perspective. Totally. This is not just, I thought early on, years ago in the past, we tended to view this from the prism of technology, number one, and then secondly, well, the government does X, the military does Y, the private sector does Z. And we're just gonna, and I'm going, that is not I don't think, that is not a model that's optimized for the digital world.
Yeah.
It's a reflection of legacy in a different time when we were very analog, largely copper-based. I just don't see it that way.
I agree, which brings us to the private sector. And a couple of aspects of it I'd like to get you to comment on if you could. One is we have a marvelous cross-section of industry. Many of the firms represented on that marvelous exhibition floor are deeply into cybersecurity. I'm sure they would welcome hearing from you where you need help, where you're trying to go, what industry can put into the government acquisition pipeline. But the second point I'd like to talk about is the one you just made perfectly, which is how important private-public cooperation is, frankly, operationally, if we're going to defend the nation. So two big questions.
Let me take the second one first,
yeah, sure.
just because it's a natural riff off the last discussion. I would like to see us get to a level of integration where we have actual physical co-location with each other.
Wow.
I mean, my experience in the military, when we create C2 structures, when we create analytic and command and control nodes, our experience leads us to believe you try to bring as much data, as many different perspectives, and as many different elements of the broad enterprise that are necessary to achieve the outcome, you try to bring them all together.
Exactly.
And I think we need to do the same thing. We've done this internally within the government to some extent. And I have people in multiple organizations, in both organizations that I'm responsible for. Other organizations have people in both our teams. But I'd like to see us evolve over time to how do we do this with the private sector? And how do we, for example, take advantage of the sector constructs that are in place for the 16 segments in private industry that have been designated as critical infrastructure to the nation?
Yeah.
How do we take advantage of that and integrate at that level? Because I'm, as an execution guy, my view is, and my experience teaches me, you want to train, you want to exercise, you want to simulate as many conditions as you can before you actually come into contact with an opponent. Yeah. And discovery learning when you're coming together for the first time at the execution level, man, I have done that. I always remember Grenada as a JG.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking to myself, I have never worked with the 82nd Airborne in my life, and I'm the naval gunfire officer on Cairn.
Yeah.
And I'm getting tasked to do combat missions for troops in contact.
Yeah.
And I'm going, I have no clue what the 80 seconds fire control procedures are. I've only worked with the MEU a little bit because it was the MEU, the afloat world, and the 82nd. One of my takeaways from that experience, it's hard to believe it was October of '83, was I do not like discovery learning when you're moving to contact. This is a terrible way to do business.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see us change.
No, that's a profoundly right point, and I'll bounce off that to say this is a bit like disaster relief. When you try to throw all that huge logistic muscle and capability of the military into a disaster relief scenario, if you haven't practiced, rehearsed, been alongside those non-governmental organizations, humanitarian organizations, is a classic soft power lesson learned. I think it absolutely applies in cyber.
And I don't mean tabletops. The other point I'm trying to make is we have to move beyond tabletops down to actual execution. Tabletops, we tend to white card or big hands.
Yeah.
Oh, don't worry, that's not an issue.
Exactly. Well, let's take the second half of the question.
I was going to say I didn't answer the other part.
No, second half of the question, which is
Keep me honest.
for the private sector, what are you hungry to see walk in the door of your office, so to speak? What capability are you missing?
So first let me talk defense and then let me talk offense. On the defensive side, we have got to get to machine learning at speed. Most defensive strategies right now are predicated on a priori knowledge. Hey, I optimize for known behaviors that I've seen before. That helps you deal with 90% of the challenge set out there. It's that 10% that you haven't seen before that tends to really kick your butt sometimes.
Yeah.
So we got to get to machine learning at speed. We got to get it to automation, and you've got to help me free up human capital. I still watch right now at times where I watch how incredibly motivated and well-trained men and women are doing tasks that I look at and go, look, we should be automating this. This is not the best use of your time, your perspective, your constructive thought. I would urge your help with that. I'd also urge on the industry side, both defense and offense, help us with human capital development. Because again, people love to talk about the technology, but at the end, our greatest edge isn't the technology. Our greatest edge is that motivated man or woman with the intellectual capacity to anticipate, to be innovative, and to be agile. Because in the end, I remind everybody that what we're dealing with is driven by a man or woman somewhere in the world sitting in a keyboard. There's a human dimension in all of this. It's not just about the machine. Defeat the man, figure out what their man or woman, figure out what their strategic intent, what's the objective. That'll identify, okay, if the objective is X, they're probably going after this terrain, they're probably going after this data, they're probably gonna use this tactic, techniques, or procedure. That's how you get ahead of the power curve. Think about this. On the offensive side, it's interesting. One of the things I'm still trying to come to grips with, so I'm speaking now as Mike Rogers conceptually, in no way for the department. In the application of kinetic functionality, weapons, we go to the private sector and we say, hey, build this thing we call a JDAM, a TLAM, an AIM 120, fill in the blank. On the offensive side, to date, we have done almost all of our weapons development internally. And part of me goes, again, 5 to 10 years now, is that a long-term sustainable model? And does that enable you to access fully the capabilities resident in the private sector? And so I'm still trying to work my way through that intellectually. Again, it goes to that a little bit. The offensive side we so tightly control, and for very valid reasons, not trying to minimize that at all. We need to make sure that anytime we apply cyber, in a non-kinetic offensive act, we fully comply with the law of armed conflict, and the same sense or constraints or rationales that govern how we deliver kinetics, proportionality, the ability to be specific, discriminatory, and exactly what we're going against, we have to do the exact same thing in cyber. Again, it's another example to me where there's a lot of commonality between these worlds.
Another clear problem we face kind of episodically, Mike, is the Snowden event. What can industry do to help you there, prevent the next Snowden? And I'd kind of, if you could walk across the personnel management, who you hire, et cetera, but also the technology piece, perhaps.
So one of the things we're trying to do, both at NSA and Cyber Command, although to be honest, this is more on the NSA hat, is ask ourselves, how can we access the expertise resident in the private sector in the insights and knowledge they have gained as they have tried to address the insider threat? This isn't unique to the intelligence world, to the DoD, to the government writ large. I've come to the conclusion there's several aspects to this. There's a human dimension of this. How do we gain insight on the individual and ensure that we've got the right person in the right position and that there's nothing inherent in the individual that would project, hey, we got a potential vulnerability or problem there. At the same time, there's a technical piece to this, how we're structuring our systems in terms of access to data, the ability to extract data, magnetic or portable media. The other dimension kind of crosses between the two of them is then the behavior piece. How do we gain insights as to how that individual is accessing that technology in a real time? And how do we do it in a way that facilitates the individual's ability both to execute their job and to do it in a timely, agile way, at the same time for us as an employer to have a high confidence that the data that they are using is being appropriately controlled and appropriately utilized. So we're trying to work, and we've got some major projects ongoing, those three kinds of lines of effort, if you will.
Let's jump out to the world at large and talk the challenges we face. And this is going to be kind of where I will ask a couple more questions, and then I'll encourage folks to ask a couple more as we have about 15 minutes left in the presentation. But Mike, can you walk us around the world and talk a little bit about what you worry about from individual nations? In other words, what do you worry about from Russia? What is their specialty? What's their level of capability? China, North Korea, Iran, any other actor you care to touch on?
So I've said before, Russia we consider to be a peer in the cyber arena. It's a high-end actor with a full range of capabilities. We have been very public, particularly if I put on my NSA hat, in categorizing the behaviors that we watched from a cyber perspective the Russians engage in with respect to our election process.
Yep.
I was part of that process. I'm not going to rehash all that, but we're very confident, hey, look, this happened. And so I think the challenge now is, so what does that mean and what are the implications for us? And is that acceptable?
Yeah.
My argument would be it's not acceptable, but I'm the first to acknowledge others might have a different perspective. I think it also highlights to us we need to rethink what critical infrastructure means in the digital age. We tended to view historically critical infrastructure as something associated with an output. Hey, air traffic, pipelines, the financial world, power distribution. Generally, we thought a very industrial set of processes that generated some sort of output. I don't think we thought to ourselves, well, what about information, data, and fundamental processes like the ability to ensure high confidence that in a Western democracy, the electoral outcome is actually reflective of the majority of our citizens, which is at the heart of the democratic model.
These are psychological vulnerabilities, I think.
So we got to think about what is critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
I think in a little different way. And data increasingly has a value now all of its own. You saw that in OPM. You're seeing it, you saw it with the Russians, the way they penetrated systems, removed data, and then provided that in a very public, unaltered format. So we got to work through that. I don't expect that, absent some fundamental change in the dynamic, I don't think that's going to change. So I think we got to step back and ask ourselves, how do we fundamentally? And we're going to need to do that more broadly. It isn't just a US problem. You're seeing this play out in Europe now. We need to work with a broader set of nations to attempt to clearly signal, I believe, this is unacceptable, and to drive the calculus in a different way. If I look at China, they continue to make, as do we and other nations, they're making significant investments. They continue to target military and some businesses associated with national security and core commercial functions, as we're aware. Both President Obama and Xi Jinping made an agreement in September of 2015 in which they said, hey, look, nation states, we acknowledge, will use cyber as a tool to generate understanding as to what is happening in the world around them. We acknowledge we do that.
Yeah, sure.
But we said the difference is we will not, both nations said we will not use the mechanisms of the state and its cyber capacity to penetrate networks, particularly on the commercial side, but also I would argue on the military side, to steal information, which then we will turn over to the private sector to generate economic advantage. And so we continue to watch that very closely.
Do you think they're living up to that agreement?
I would say for us, the jury is still out a little bit.
Yeah.
Do we see reduced levels of some activity? Yes.
Okay.
Have I seen them totally walk away from the idea of cyber as a tool? No.
Not quite yet.
If I look at North Korea and Iran, North Korea, you go back to November of 14, where we had the North Koreans engage in offensive action via cyber against the Sony Entertainment Corporation. We took a measure of steps, the US government did in the aftermath of that. Knock on wood, we're coming up on 2.5 years. We have not seen that same activity directed from an offensive standpoint. I will say we continue to observe North Korean activity directed against some elements within the United States. I'm not going to get into specifics, but we also see them being very aggressive with other nation states. And so we're trying to partner with some of those nation states to ensure that we're able to address that. And then the Iranians, it continues to be a strong investment area for them. You saw them engage in denial of service efforts against the financial sector back in the 2011, 2013 timeframe. We have seen activity ongoing in the Gulf right now that continues to be of concern to us. The Saudis.
Directed against the Saudis.
Right, directed against the Saudis and
where
others.
they have a long history, of course.
Where we would argue, boy, that's an area of concern.
Yeah.
The one that I'm still waiting to happen, I hope it doesn't, but my gut tells me it's going to. What happens when the non-state actor believes that cyber is not just a recruitment tool, an ideology, in a way, and resources, funding, and command and control of geographically dispersed elements? What happens when they decide, boy, this is a weapon system that we could use to reach out on a global basis? We haven't seen that yet, but I spent a lot of time worrying about, because it's only the when to me.
You should.
Yeah,
if we think about the future of 21st century warfare, if you will, the new triad is special forces, cyber, and unmanned. Terrorists, violent extremists, jihadists have used special forces. That's what San Bernardino is. That's what Orlando is. They are now moving into unmanned.
Right.
We see Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State both using unmanned drones. It is but a matter of time, and I would argue not a long period of time before we see them, as you say, weaponizing cyber.
Jack.
Well, let me open it up to the audience, and if you would like to step up to microphone, I guess is the forum here.
Come on down.
I see someone coming right over here. And please name and affiliation.
Sure. Lucian Niemeyer. I have my own consulting practice in the D.C. area.
Nice, sir.
Appreciate, Admiral, your outstanding comments. One concern I have, in the beginning of your comments, you emphasized the operational domain. My concern, as a proud Navy War College graduate, we learned that predominantly American military force serves first to be a deterrent. And from my perspective, in the cyber domain, that's been an absolute failure for us, because we do have millions of attacks, some have been successful, that have either stolen social security numbers or, even worse, threaten the fundamental nature of our U.S. economy if there's a successful attack. So at what point can you turn the cyber capability in this country into a deterrent, whereby a perpetrator, whether it be a nation state or an individual actor, knows that if he carries out an attack on a network, he or she will be brought to justice? So at what point do we make that happen?
Got it. I would argue that we should view cyber as one element of a broader deterrent campaign. To think about cyber as one dimension of something bigger. Because I think that's got a greater probability of of achieving the outcome that you've referenced than if you just look at cyber through a very, narrow prism of tit for tat kind of things. I do agree we have got to fundamentally change the dynamic, because right now most nation states, some nation states, many actors have come to the conclusion that there's little price to pay and the value far outstrips any price you might have to pay. We got to change that dynamic, or we're going to continue in this. Put another way, at times in my job, I feel, as do the teams that I'm a part of, like we are just sticking our finger in the dike, and I'm going, this is a losing strategy, it is resource intensive, and we are reacting. And my military culture teaches me, you get out in front of problem sets, you shape opponent behavior, and you drive them to make choices that in fact help support your desired outcome in end state, not theirs. And we've got to do the exact same thing in the cyber arena, and we're a ways from that. I'm the first to acknowledge.
Thank you. Next.
Good morning.
Morning.
Sidney Friedberg from Breaking Defense. I wanted to pull on what you said about moving cyber over the next 5 to 10 years down to more of the operational, tactical levels, you know, from this sort of super secret squirrel stuff at the strategic level to something that, you know, a strike group commander has in his toolkit. Two complications to that. One is, at least two.
Can I ask you to just pose a question?
Sure.
We've got a couple of people right behind you.
Sure.
He's ruthless. He is ruthless.
I mean, how do you deal with the fact that, you know, your tactical commander's focus is very local, geographically confined, yet, you know, a cyber action in one place can inadvertently percolate globally? And how do you deal with how the way cyber at the tactical level is interwoven with, again, a purely local physics effect, electromagnetic spectrum warfare? Those two are interdependent, but the authorities and the physics are totally different.
Jack, so first let me push back a little bit on your present premise. What is stopping us from pushing it down to the tactical level is it's not the classification, it ain't the super secret stuff. That has nothing, to be honest, that has little if anything to do with it. It's more this, can you get the authority, can you get the rules of engagement right now that would allow you to actually employ it? It's not some classification issue. My comment would be, look, the same thing happens in the kinetic world. In the world we're living in now, the tactical application of kinetic force often has strong strategic implications well beyond the immediate physical environment of the application of that force. Cyber has many of those same characteristics, and just as we have come up with a series of processes, controls, and oversight that govern the application of force in the traditional ways that tries to make sure we address that strategic impact with tactical application, I think we can do the exact same thing over time with cyber. And I acknowledge we have to do that. I'm the first to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Next up.
Good morning, sir. Mike Dom, Office of
Mike.
Naval Intelligence. Good to see you again, sir. Admiral Stavridis started talking about this transition or this change from the physical space to the virtual space. And I'd argue there's kind of a chasm in between the two of spectrum and electronic warfare, the CNO's initiative on electromagnetic maneuver warfare. Should cybercom have a role in electronic warfare? And if not, who are you looking to ensure access to spectrum in order to gain access to that virtual space?
Boy, thanks, Mike. That's a great question. It's another thing I should have mentioned in the 5 to 10-year view. For the first time in the last year, I'm starting to get, sometimes in very public forums, this same question about, hey, look, as you see the spectrum and the network converging, as you see the integration of the spectrum, the network, information, and effects, does that argue then that you need to view cyber as an element of something broader? And would you, as a result of that, potentially, for example, build around cybercom or some other organization or construct, the idea of bringing those functions together? I would argue the most likely answer over time is yes. This is one where I'm a little torn. Intellectually, I say to myself, perfect sense, logical conclusion, what we need to build to. When I get asked, so, hey, Mike, could you do this right now? I suck in my teeth a little bit with, man, you know how much work I'm trying to get? I'm trying to get us steered, moving down the channel from right in the middle where we want to be. It's a little bit about timing to me, but intellectually it makes sense to me.
Good question. And last question.
Morning, Admirals. Lieutenant Sean Quirk from Desron 31, and
Lieutenant.
incoming student at the Fletcher School.
Oh, excellent.
Oh, way to suck up to this guy. Way to suck up to him.
Awesome.
Sir, a follow-up question on your co-location with industry. So I grew up in Palo Alto, and wondering if Cyber Command is going to build a det in Silicon Valley. And then secondly, how forthcoming have the high-tech companies in Silicon Valley been to confront overseas cyber threats?
So actually, Cyber Command already has a detachment in Silicon Valley. We call it the Point of Partnership. It's been in place since 2014. In fact, DIUX kind of grew from the presence we had out there, where others in the department became aware of it and approached me saying, hey, look, we think this is something we could build on. How can we make this larger, a broader mission set, not larger in size, but a broader mission set than just the focus on cyber. And DIUX is in place doing some great things. We support DOI, that Point of Partnership supports DIUX. We're co-located with each other. I'll be honest, we're in a better place overall in terms of DoD, Intel in particular, relationship with the private sector. I think we're able to take some of the emotion out of the past few years and look, could we just deal with the facts? Let's take the emotion out of this, just deal with the facts. Others will have a different perspective. That doesn't bother me at all. That's the nature of life. I just want that perspective to be based on fact and not allegations and some often fairly inaccurate reporting that I see. Not that it's all totally inaccurate, I don't mean to claim that, but. So that's clearly where we need to go in the future. I'm trying now, to be honest, to ask myself what would make sense on the NSA side.
Thank you very much. Well, we've had an opportunity to be with a remarkable Navy officer, but I would argue a remarkable intellect, as well as an extraordinarily kind, humorous, and good-natured leader in a very difficult and challenging space. Join me in a great round of applause.
Can I make one
for
closing
Admiral?
comment?
You
if
can't
would
wait.
mind?
Sorry.
I apologize, you guys.
Closing comment.
First, let me thank Jim, and he's heard me say this to him before. He has been an intellectual leader in the maritime environment since he was a midshipman. You think about that. We tend to take that for granted. We're lucky that we have individuals like Jim Stavridis who are willing to continue to engage in this dialogue, even as they have moved on to a different phase of their life and a different time in their life. And quite frankly, the only reason I'm here today is along the way, he was kind enough, we worked together, and he's kind enough to give me some insights to help me keep growing and learning as a naval officer and as a maritime professional. The comment I wanted to make to all of you was, one of the reasons I try to do things like this is I am the first to acknowledge I can't sit at Fort Meade to do my job. We have got to get out and about. We have got to interface with our nation, our allies, and we've got to talk to the private sector. There is an amazing amount of innovation, insight, and analytic expertise and horsepower in this room. Our strength as a nation historically has been our ability to bring that all together, powered particularly here in areas of the West Coast, but other areas, by this culture of innovation that has made changes that are the envy of the rest of the world and that today are taken for granted by many. So I ask your help as we move forward. I'm responsible, along with my teammates, many of which you've seen here today, who are great, hardworking men and women. I ask for your help in trying to move forward as a nation. The cyber dynamic we're dealing with now, I don't think any of us like where we are. And I don't like admiring problems, I like fixing problems. And I'm gonna need your help, as will others, to help us do just that. I hope you take some measure of confidence from the men and women you've seen over the last few days who are part of that cyber enterprise. If you could see these young, motivated men and women, young petty officers, NCOs, junior officers, civilians, when they're working a problem set, oh man, it's one of my proudest days as a leader. I just love being around them. And they are doing amazing things for this nation, and they're doing amazing things for the United States Navy. And thank you very much for your guys' time today.
Can't top that. Well done, Mike. That was fabulous.
Thanks, Jim.
That was so cool. Thank you.
So Admiral Stavridis and Admiral Rogers, I want to thank you very much for this discussion here. Admiral Stavridis for guiding us and directing us, and Admiral Rogers for your candor. I mean, you've been a great ally and a great partner. And the thing that is refreshing, you're dealing in an area that is very complex, compartmented in some ways, but you've done a tremendous job in opening up the discussion so that people can be better informed and better educated. And I think one of the things I truly like about what you're doing is you're trying to reach not just within the Department of Defense, but you take this on as a national security issue. So thank you very much. As a token of our appreciation, I'd like to present this book, Cyberspace and Peace and War, by Martin Libicki. Martin is certainly heavily engaged.
From the spring 2017 USNI catalog.
Exactly. Thanks so much. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. What a great session. Thank you.
Bob. Thanks.
Wow,
Thank
that's
you all.
great. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome